December 17, 1944, somewhere near Saint-Vith, Belgium. The ground shuddered under tank treads, the trees sagged beneath a heavy snow, and beneath a pale sun, a column of American infantry trudged into the unknown. Private First Class Andrew Keating of the 106th Infantry Division kept one hand on his rifle, the other pressed into the pocket of his wool coat, where the corner of a folded photo had worn the fabric thin. He hadn't looked at it yet that morning, not because he didn't want to, but because if he looked, he might forget how to keep moving. 2,000 American soldiers were spread across this snow-choked line, stretched thin in what Army Command called a quiet sector. But the noise they were hearing now, the distant crump of artillery, the unnatural silence between bursts, told them otherwise. Keating squinted toward the tree-lined fog billowing from his breath, heart pacing not from cold but from instinct. The Germans were coming. That much was certain. What no one knew yet was just how many. And what Keating couldn't know, was that the photograph pressed against his chest would outlive him, and that the girl in the picture wouldn't see it again until it arrived wrapped in a folded flag. He had met her the summer before the war. Madison. Her name alone could pull him out of darkness. Blonde hair tied in a ribbon, blue eyes like sunlight on river water, and a laugh that stopped him cold outside the bakery in Brooklyn. He was just a clerk at her father's hardware store. She was the girl who never noticed him until she did. When he left for basic, she tucked a photo into his pack. It was candid, hair tousled, grinning, sleeves rolled up. "This is so you don't forget what you're coming back to," she said. He had no idea how much that photo would matter. They called it the Ardennes, a frozen maze of pines and hills, roads that vanished under snow and foxholes that swallowed warmth. The 106th had been sent to hold a line, not advance, not attack, just hold. But the line had begun to move, not forward, sideways, back. On the 16th the shells had started. On the 17th the forest had come alive with armor, tigers, panthers, Waffen-SS. Keating crouched behind a snowbank, his breath hitching, watching as shadows moved beyond the trees. His sergeant hissed, "They're flanking us, we need to move." He wanted to reach for the photo, just once, just a glance, but the rifle in his hands reminded him what mattered now. The first firefight tore apart the silence. Machine guns chattered, tree bursts screamed, men scrambled, yelling over each other. Keating fired blindly at muzzle flashes, felt ice dig into his knees, watched as one friend dropped with a hole in his chest. They fell back 100 yards, then another 100. German tanks rumbled through the smoke like beasts made of iron and diesel. By nightfall his company was cut off, radios silent, ammunition low. He dug into the snow with shaking hands, every breath burning his throat. Then finally, when the sky darkened and the shooting paused, he opened the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out the worn, folded photo. Even in the darkness he could see her face, her smile, like it was looking through him. He didn't cry, not then. He just stared until his hands stopped shaking. They tried to break out the next morning. It wasn't a battle, it was a collapse. German voices echoed through the trees, barking orders, coordinating fire. Mortars bracketed the hills. Keating's squad moved tree to tree, slipping through the chaos, trying to reach friendlies to the west. Corporal Dean took a bullet in the neck. Michaels disappeared in the smoke. By the time Keating made it over the ridge, he was alone. He reached into his coat, but the photo was gone. His heart stopped. He tore at his gear, searching every pocket, frantic, nothing. Then there, on the ground, face down in the snow, half buried by boot prints, the photo. He dropped to his knees, picked it up like it might shatter. A bullet snapped past his ear. He rolled, fired, scrambled backward into the trees. But he had the photo again. And that meant everything. A week later, Keating was found in a ravine near Laudisfeld, half-conscious, frostbitten, alone. He couldn't speak, could barely move. They loaded him onto a stretcher. A medic unbuttoned his coat and found the photo clutched in his hand, the ink smudged but the smile intact. "Girlfriend?" the medic asked. Keating nodded once. Back in Brooklyn, Madison kept the war at bay with work. She filled in for her father, sorted nails, cleaned aisles, smiled when she had to. He hadn't written in weeks. She told herself it was the mail. She told herself boys couldn't always write. But every day, she opened the mailbox with hope. Every day it was empty. She didn't know that his name had just been added to a casualty list drawn up near Bostonia, that his dog tags were being typed onto a form. She didn't know the photo had gone back into his coat pocket before he lost consciousness again. That when he died on the stretcher 3 hours later, he still had her face pressed against his chest. It was months before the letter arrived. She was sorting bolts when her father handed her the envelope, Army issue, brown, her name printed neatly. Inside were 2 medals, a silver star and a purple heart. And behind them, sealed in a slip of plastic, folded once down the middle, her photograph. She stared at it for a long time before she opened the letter. And when she read the words, she sank to the floor of the hardware store, holding that worn piece of paper like it was a heartbeat. He had carried it across Europe, through foxholes, through fire, through a frozen forest full of death. And somehow, without ever knowing it, he had kept his promise. Spring 1945. The war was ending, but no one believed it. Not really, not yet. Madison pressed the photo flat on her desk. She had wiped it clean 4 times. The top edge was torn. There was a new crease across the middle that hadn't been there when she gave it to him. His blood had soaked part of the back. She didn't know that. No one told her. The Army letter had said he died in the line of duty, near the Ardennes. Heroic action, posthumous commendation, returned with personal effects. Personal effects, that was the phrase they used. But it wasn't a wallet, it wasn't dog tags. It was a photograph. Of her. She didn't cry at first, not the day the letter arrived, not the day they gave her the box, not even when she saw the medal, heavy and cold, in the bottom of it. But that night when the snow started falling, not the gentle kind, but the thick kind, the kind that buried everything in silence, she sat alone in the kitchen, fingers tracing the edge of the photo, and whispered his name. Andrew. That's when it broke. He had written her 16 letters between June 1944 and November. They were all stacked in the drawer beside her bed, tied with string. Most were short. He never said much, just small things, that he missed her, that he liked the coffee in England more than he expected, that someone had painted Kilroy was here on a bomb. She read them every night now. The last one ended with, "Tell your dad I'll need the job back after this, if he'll have me. If not, I'll just take you and we'll move to the country, sell chickens or something." It wasn't poetry, but it was him. In Belgium, the snows melted. Graves thawed. Graves were moved. They found Andrew's temporary burial marker crooked, barely visible between trees. The war had moved on, but the dead had not. A recovery team exhumed him alongside 4 others. They logged the name, serial number, unit, cause of death. They checked the pockets one final time. Still there, still folded, still hers. The photo was returned to the envelope with his records, labeled, filed. She would not receive it for another 3 months. Brooklyn moved on, stores reopened, people laughed again. Madison tried, she really did. She went to church. She attended Gold Star family events. She thanked people when they called him a hero. But the truth was, she didn't know how to feel. They hadn't been engaged. They weren't married. They had kissed twice, once before he left, once when he shipped out. She didn't wear black, didn't call herself a widow. And yet, every time she passed the hardware store, she looked for his reflection in the window. Every time a car slowed on her street, she paused. Just in case. His mother had written her, once. A formal letter, stiff, polite. He spoke of you often. We were honored he had someone like you in his life. If you ever wish to visit, our door is open. Madison never replied. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't the widow. She wasn't family. She was just the girl in the photograph. In May, victory was declared in Europe. VE Day. The streets filled with noise, flags waved, horns blared. Madison stayed inside. That night she lit a candle, not out of patriotism, but because electricity felt too harsh. She pulled out the photo again. And this time she noticed something. On the back, faint in pencil, he had written a date. November 26, 1944. She had no idea what it meant. She didn't know that was the day he'd been cut off with a platoon outside St. Vith. That it was the night he and 3 others were shelled while trying to bring wounded men to a makeshift aid station. She didn't know that after pulling the last man to cover, Keating had slumped beside him, chest torn open, fingers frozen around the photo. She didn't know the medic who found him an hour later had tried to write down the details, but the paper was soaked. Only the date had survived. In July, a telegram arrived from a private in Keating's unit. He had made it home. He'd found her address on Keating's service card. His name was Travers. The message read, "He talked about you every day, always carried the photo, showed it to new guys like it was magic. Last thing he said was, 'Tell Madison she's what kept me walking.'" She read it twice, then a third time, then dropped it. The note landed beside the photograph. She stared at both for a long time. Then she got up, walked to her desk, and began to write. The letter Madison wrote that day never left her hands. She wrote it on cream paper, the same kind she'd used the summer he'd left, back when she wrote him about weather and store gossip and how she'd seen his brother at the train station. Now she wrote slowly, carefully, as if he could still read it. "I got the photo back," she began. "I never knew you kept it. I never knew how close it stayed to you. I never deserved that kind of place. But I wish I could have said goodbye." She didn't say everything. She couldn't. How do you condense the ache of unfinished life into lines of ink? How do you explain to someone dead that you think about them more now than when they were alive? She signed her name, folded the letter, and placed it in the same envelope that once carried his medals. She didn't mail it. There was nowhere to send it now. But it felt like something she owed. August came with heat and sirens. Newsboys shouted about Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Madison stared at the radio as Truman's voice filled the kitchen. Victory, unconditional surrender. People cheered in the streets. Church bells rang. Women wept into flags and streamers and hands. She stood alone at the window. The victory wasn't hers. Not really. Not the way it was for other girls, the ones who held arms again, who kissed uniforms returning from ships and trains. Her war had ended months ago. She just didn't know what to do with the silence that came next. She tried. She really did. She took a job at the telephone company, answering calls with a smile. She wore lipstick again, even danced once at a USO fundraiser when someone pulled her from her chair. But nothing lasted. Every time she laughed, she felt like she was leaving something behind. Every time she started to forget, his face came back. Not in pain, not in uniforms or flags. Just the way he'd looked the first time he saw her, like he wasn't quite ready to believe she was real. That winter she boarded a train, alone. She had decided. She would go see his parents. Not for them, not for duty. But because she needed someone to tell her he was real. That he wasn't just a photograph in a drawer or a medal in a box. She rode through Pennsylvania and Ohio, watching snow fall in fits against the window. No one spoke much. The whole country was still recovering. When she arrived at the station, his mother was waiting, a small woman with gray at her temples and hands that didn't quite know where to go. They didn't hug, not at first. They just looked at each other. Then the older woman said, "You're her." And Madison, for once, had nothing to say. His room was still the same. Books on the shelf, a cracked baseball glove, a drawer that stuck when you pulled too hard. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the desk, untouched. "I used to clean in here every day," his mother said from the doorway. "I stopped after the telegram. I thought maybe if I left it long enough, he'd walk back into it." Madison stood slowly, walked to the desk, opened the drawer. Inside, beneath letters and a photograph of his unit, was another photo of her. Different from the one she gave him. It was from a street fair. She remembered the moment. A friend had snapped it while she wasn't looking. She didn't even know he had a copy. She held it up silent. His mother nodded. "He took that with him to basic, carried it till he got your real one." Madison smiled. It hurt to do it, but it came anyway. That night they sat at the kitchen table, just the two of them, a pot of tea between them and the soft hum of a distant train. "I never told him I loved him," Madison said quietly. "He knew," his mother replied. Madison didn't speak again for a long time. But later, as she folded her coat and laid it across the chair, she touched the photo in her pocket. She hadn't lost it again, not this time. She had carried it here, to where he was from, to the place he grew up. And in some small way, she felt like he'd come home too. The snow had melted by the time she left Ohio. Everything looked cleaner in spring, the roads less ghosted, the windows brighter. But that brightness only made the absence sharper. She boarded the return train alone. No one met her at the station in Brooklyn. No one was supposed to. Her father was working. Her mother was in New Jersey visiting her aunt. It was just her now. Just the apartment. Just the drawer by her bed where the photograph and the medals waited. The city was rebuilding itself. War factories turned to peacetime production. Boys with missing limbs stood in line for jobs. Girls once kept out of offices were now typing memos in triplicate. The rhythm of normal life had returned, but not to her. She moved through it like a shape cut out of the sidewalk. It had been 8 months since Andrew's death. 8 months since the photograph had returned to her in an envelope she still hadn't thrown away. She kept the letter too, the one from Travers, folded between the pages of a book she no longer remembered starting. She read it sometimes at night, not for what it said, but for what it reminded her of, that someone had seen him in those final moments, that someone else knew he hadn't died alone. She wasn't sure if that was true, but she wanted to believe it. The hardware store had changed ownership during the war. The new owner kept the Keating name out front for a while, local respect, but it was gone by spring. Madison still walked past it now and then. She would slow a little at the corner, but never stop. She'd glance at the glass where Andrew used to catch her reflection and move on. She still remembered the first time he tried to ask her out. She had been stacking paint cans. He stood behind her for a full minute before saying, "Do you know if you have more of that smile in stock?" She turned around and looked at him like he was a ghost, then laughed. He blushed so hard his ears went pink, and she said, "Say that again when you're not shaking." He never did. He just waited until her shift ended and walked her home instead. Letters kept coming. Not from him, of course not, but from the War Department, from the VA, from people trying to settle the dead. Settling the dead, that's what it felt like. Final adjustments, official confirmations, a form to acknowledge receipt of his personal effects, a second Silver Star citation sent due to a clerical error. The paperwork of grief. She filled them out, signed the lines, kept a file folder in the bottom drawer of her desk with everything neatly organized. She didn't know why. Maybe part of her needed proof that it had happened, that he had existed, that the photograph hadn't come from nowhere. In June, a man knocked on the door. He wore a jacket with sergeant stripes stitched to the sleeve. Late 30s, quiet. When she opened the door, he took off his cap. "Miss Madison?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm Travers." She stood still for a moment, blinking. I thought you were." "I didn't expect to be in Brooklyn either," he said, "but I was passing through, I thought." He didn't finish the sentence. She stepped aside and let him in. He didn't stay long. They talked at the kitchen table. He looked older than she expected, not in years, in eyes. He didn't describe the day Andrew died. She didn't ask, but he did say this. Every night before patrol, he'd pull out that photo. He'd look at it like it was orders, like as long as he had that, the rest didn't matter. She nodded, bit her lip, swallowed the shaking in her throat. "He wasn't loud," Travers added. "He wasn't the guy with the big stories. But when things went bad, and they always did, he was the one you followed." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, square item wrapped in paper. "I've been carrying this. I thought you should have it." She unwrapped it slowly. Dog tags. But not the ones from the army box. These were his duplicates, the ones they wore tucked inside their shirts, the ones he probably touched every night out of habit. She pressed them into her palm, eyes stinging. "I'm sorry," Travers said. "I wish." "No," she interrupted. "Thank you." And she meant it. That night she took the photo from its drawer, laid it flat on her desk, set the tags beside it. She stared at them both for a long time, then picked up a pen and started writing. The letter she wrote that night was the first since the one she never mailed. This one she did. She didn't know what made her do it. Maybe it was the look in Travers' eyes, or the weight of the tags in her hand, or the way the city seemed to hush around her when she finally touched pen to paper. She wrote it to Andrew's mother. She told her what Travers said. She described the tags, the way he carried the photo, the way his name still echoed like a heartbeat when spoken aloud. She didn't try to be poetic, just honest. At the end, she added a line that had come to her in the quiet. "I used to think the photograph was all that was left of him, but now I think it's what remains of me, too." She sealed the envelope, walked it to the post box on the corner. And for the first time since the war ended, she didn't look back when she dropped it in. Summer came early that year. The city buzzed with movement again. Children played in hydrant spray. Streetcars rattled past flower stands. One afternoon, while reorganizing a shelf of books she hadn't touched in a year, Madison found a ticket stub folded into a paperback. She didn't remember which movie it was from. Maybe one of the newsreel specials. Maybe the last one they saw before he shipped out. She held it a moment, then placed it on the desk beside the photograph. The photo had faded slightly, the corners curled. The crease across the middle would never smooth out. But her smile in the picture remained unchanged, still tilted, still caught between surprised and amused. She tried to remember what he had looked like when he first saw it. What she'd never seen, what she could only imagine, was the way he must have pulled it out in the cold, or under fire, or in the hours before something terrible. Maybe just for a second. Maybe just to see something not made of war. She moved in late September. The apartment had grown too quiet, too filled with echoes of things unfinished. She didn't go far, just down the block above a laundromat. The rent was cheaper, the walls thinner, the sounds of the neighborhood closer somehow. She brought little with her, a suitcase, 3 books, a coffee tin full of nickels. And the photo. It sat on the nightstand unframed, unspoken, but always within reach. One evening, coming back from work, she stopped at a bookstore. There was a display in the window, a new memoir by a GI who had fought in France. She went inside, flipped through pages, found passages about foxholes, about ration kits, about names scrawled in helmets. She didn't buy the book, but she left feeling something different, not sorrow, not pride, something quieter. A sense that maybe she wasn't the only one who had been shaped by something invisible. That there were more stories like hers, tucked into drawers, folded into wallets, buried with dog tags. She never married. It wasn't a vow, it wasn't dramatic. She had offers, decent men, kind men, men who would have done right by her. But no one ever made her feel like he had. And she didn't want a life built on comparison. She wanted something real, even if that real was just memory. Years passed, the photograph stayed with her. She kept it in a small wooden box by her bedside. Inside it were the tags, the medals, the ticket stub, and the letter she wrote but never mailed. The ink had faded, the photo had yellowed. But every time she opened it, it was as if nothing had aged at all. In 1963, she returned to Ohio. Not for ceremony, not for reunion, just to see it again. The Keating house was still there, though the parents had passed. A new family lived there now. Children played in the yard. She didn't knock. She stood across the street and watched. Then walked to the edge of the property, knelt by the old maple and left something behind. A pressed flower wrapped in paper with no note. It wasn't for them. It was for him. She lived long, quietly. She taught school, volunteered at the hospital, tended to a little garden behind the building. She never made speeches, never told war stories. But when she died, her niece found the box. The photo, the medals, the tags. And a short note folded in with the letter, added later in life, in a different hand. He carried my photograph across Europe, and now I carry him in everything I do. The niece didn't know the full story, but she kept the box. And someday someone else would open it and wonder about the girl in the photo and the boy who never stopped carrying her. She passed away in her sleep. No hospitals, no machines, just the soft click of a clock in the kitchen and the breeze shifting a curtain. It was July, and the sun was already warming the floorboards when her niece came to check in, like she did every Saturday morning. Madison lay in bed, hands folded, face peaceful. On the nightstand was the photograph. It hadn't been framed, not once in 80 years, just kept safe, folded, pressed, faded by time but not meaning. Beside it sat the tags, the medals, the folded letter. And beneath them, a small scrap of paper in Madison's familiar cursive. He never got to grow old, so I did it for both of us. They held a quiet service. Mostly family, a few former students, a neighbor who brought flowers. There was no mention of war in the obituary, no grand speeches. But when her niece was sorting through the last of the belongings, she found the box, still kept intact, wrapped in cloth, labeled simply, Andrew. She opened it on the dining room table. The photo was brittle now, the smile still intact, the creases deeper. The metals had dulled, but the engraving still read clear. The tags clinked softly when lifted. She didn't cry, not yet, but she knew this wasn't just a keepsake. This was the shape of a life that had existed inside hers. She placed the photograph back into the box, carefully, like laying down glass. Then she closed the lid and sat still for a long time. The box remained with her. For years, she didn't speak about it much. But whenever someone asked about her aunt, about Madison, she'd say, "She loved someone once. He didn't come home, but he never really left." And if they asked more, she'd hand them the box, let them open it, let them see for themselves. because nothing else could explain it the same way. Eventually, the photograph was preserved, scanned, archived, placed into a small exhibition at the War Letters Museum in New Jersey. The display was simple: a photo, a folded letter, 2 dog tags, and a bronze star dulled by time. The placard read, PFC Andrew Keating, 106th Infantry Division, killed in action, Belgium, December 1944. The photograph was found in his coat pocket. It remained with him until his death. Then it remained with her. Visitors passed by it every day. Some stopped, most didn't, but every once in a while someone would pause a little longer. A girl on a school trip, a young man about to deploy, a widow from another war. And for them, that photograph of a girl with her sleeves rolled up and her eyes caught mid-laugh said more than any monument. It said love survives the silence. It said not every ending is forgotten. It said that sometimes a war can last only a moment, but its memory can be carried a whole lifetime. And long after that photograph fades for good, someone will still remember the man who carried it, and the woman who kept it safe. Because that's what love does. It leaves a trace, even when no one's left to know the whole story.